Good afternoon, and welcome to the Manny Gomez Show. Today, we have Mike Reilly, who is joining us and represents the 62nd District of the New York State Assembly. Thank you so much for joining us on our show. I'm a fan of yours because we come cut from the same cloth. We both came from the New York City Police Department, and now you're the big man on campus up in Albany. So thank you for being with us. Here in New York, fentanyl has dramatically increased the number of overdose deaths, yet Governor Kathy Hochul vetoed legislation that would have created a state task force to combat the state's fight against this deadly drug. The bill passed legislation without a single vote against it. So what was Hochul's reasoning behind the veto, Assemblyman?
Well, Manny, thank you for having me. And, I don't know what her reasoning is. The only thing I could surmise is that there's been some pushback about creating task force, and a lot of it's duplicity, and it becomes an overbearing on our budget, right? But the unfortunate thing is she didn't use common sense and actually say, oh, well, this task force would actually help save lives. So she put money above lives. And by vetoing this task force, she is now taking away a tool and an opportunity for us to truly help our communities.
How often does the entire assembly on both sides vote something like this without anybody saying a nay?
For us to come and vote unanimously in support of legislation, then we know and understand what our constituents want, what our communities need. And that piece of legislation creating the fentanyl task force is definitely something that our communities need. And unfortunately, I think the second floor, which is a code that we use and we refer to the governor's office, I think they were unfortunately tone deaf to that call from our community.
Where is this fentanyl coming from, and why? Why not the traditional drugs that we always hear about? Where did fentanyl arise from, and why is it so pervasive on our city streets?
Well, the unfortunate thing is we just weren't keeping up in the times in creating laws to add specific drugs to the classifications. And fentanyl is one of those drugs that unfortunately we are probably at least 5 to 10 years behind the times when it comes to that. We recently just passed legislation, I think it was last year, that it actually added fentanyl to that class of drug where it would be a felony and it would be punishable by a long term in prison. Unfortunately, we now are seeing the after effects and we're not catching up in time.
So are you saying that fentanyl wasn't really illegal the way it is now up to a year or so ago?
Yeah, that's correct. There just wasn't enough. It wasn't put on the list of category that would make it a crime and hold people accountable for it because it's a synthetic manufactured drug. And unfortunately, this happens quite often when we have drugs that are made by man and they develop into something that we didn't expect.
Wow, that's incredible that at least I've been hearing, I'm sure most of our viewers have been hearing, that fentanyl has been a problem for years, and for government to now finally catch up with that and make it illegal after so many years and so many lives that have been lost to it is really striking.
The reason why it actually was an issue was because it didn't fit into a category that was that could be prosecuted, and the persons responsible for dealing fentanyl weren't given the appropriate sentences. So that's where the tweak to the law needed to be made. There was something for controlled substances, but it was a lower level crime, so there wasn't real accountability. Now we're in a position where we can hold them accountable. And then, it all comes back to what the district attorneys can do and the tools and resources that we give them.
Is this the perfect storm? You have bail reform, you have use all over the place, and you don't have prosecution of these drugs. Is this similar to what happened in the drug epidemic of a couple of decades ago, where there was crack all over the place and people unfortunately were overdosing and dying?
Man, I think you hit the nail on the head there, because this is creating the perfect storm, as you said. We have bail reform, which was implemented, and certain aspects of drug possession and drug dealing are not bail eligible offenses. So the person would not be held as a threat to the community, as a risk of flight. So they would be released. It would be catch and release. So in essence, we may be actually seeing something that's even has a greater impact than the crack epidemic in the 80s,
Wow.
because now we have the opportunity where drug dealers are really going to go through revolving doors. So before the ink is dry on the online booking system paper, they will be out in the street pitching their stuff again.
So, amongst all of this crime that's going on, and more importantly, all the people that are overdosing on this product, we have now made all these laws that don't let prosecutors or judges keep them out of the city streets and protect the people, while at the same time they're protecting the drug dealers that are pushing these drugs to the youth to put them out and sell them. Does that sound like an accurate statement, Assemblyman?
Yeah, Manny, it does. And unfortunately, there's an underlying theme in the New York State legislature and from the Capitol. And, it's unfortunate that they are putting criminals above victims. And that is a common theme that I've been involved in and speaking out against since 2019 when I first took office. And I think that is something that the everyday New Yorker needs to know. They need to understand that there's no common ground here. Unfortunately, one party rule in New York State has given us the perfect storm that we discussed. And I think that is something that we need to understand, we need to appreciate, and we need to accept, but we need the public's help because they need to speak up. They need to say that we're not going to be victims anymore. And unfortunately, the state legislature and the governor have made them victims more than once. Once by the initial crime, and the second time by not being able to prosecute the offenders.
Very well put, Assemblyman. And the way they do that, obviously, is to vote, and to vote for the people that are against all this bail reform and all these other laws that they put into place, where it's, as you mentioned earlier, catch and release. And what's the point in the police officer making an arrest and risking his or her life in the process of doing so, while at the same time the judge is powerless to keep this person in jail because of the laws that have been passed by certain legislators up in the state. So you introduced legislation that would actually increase accountability and penalties on adolescent offenders in possession of a loaded gun. What are the penalties in place?
So right now, if someone who is under 18, say 16, 17-year-old, because it used to be in New York State before raise the age, that if you committed a crime that was a felony or a misdemeanor and you were 16 years of age or older, you were charged as an adult in criminal court. With raise the age, they raised the age of responsibility in criminal court to 18. So you have to be 18 years old. If you are under 18 years old and you commit a designated felony, that you would start off in youth part criminal. So if you're 16 and 17-year-old and you have a loaded firearm on the street, it's in your waistband, police officer sees the outline of a gun, they stop to question you. The 16-year-old goes to the waistband, police officer sees that, stops him, puts his hand on it, discovers the loaded firearm, pulls it out, now places the 16-year-old under arrest. That 16-year-old would originally start out in youth part criminal court. Unfortunately, the way raise the age was established in the law, the only way that it would remain in youth part criminal court is if that 16-year-old displayed the firearm or used that firearm in the commission of a crime, say to commit a robbery, and displayed it. If they pointed it at someone and menaced someone with it, that could stay in youth part criminal. Being that they only had that loaded firearm in their waistband, it automatically goes to family court. And we know that family court is not punitive. There is no accountability. It is more of a restorative practice. And it's generally used for those crimes that are have less impact on the community. They are not violent. They can't hurt someone. You know, Governor Hochul announced that there was a firearms problem in New York City. She declared a state of emergency. When she declared that state of emergency for firearms in New York City, I actually called on her to suspend by executive order, raise the age, so that 16 and 17-year-olds would be held accountable if they have a loaded firearm. How can we combat gun violence in New York City if we are going to let 16 and 17-year-olds carry firearms with no accountability? In Queens, there was one 16-year-old that was arrested with a firearm. He turned 17. He was arrested 4 more times for a firearm. They recovered in 5 arrests 6 firearms from that individual. And he's not even 18 yet.
Wow.
So you tell me, is there a problem with the laws that were passed in New York State?
Well, clearly they are, because the statistics, the numbers don't lie, and the numbers are coming from the city and state law enforcement agencies. Crime is up in most of the violent felonies that occur. And so numbers don't lie. They come from the agencies, both in the city and state. So this has to be addressed in a different way than it's being addressed now.
You know, Manny, I will say that one key factor that people aren't recognizing, I think, is the NYPD has been very proactive in going after guns in New York City. To date, they have recovered more firearms and arrests than they have in the past. Now, what that tells me is the NYPD is still doing their job, but it also tells me that the laws have now empowered criminals to carry their firearms again. Right. Years ago, when we had some teeth in prosecutions of firearms, people didn't carry their firearms.
They were afraid
that
to.
became the community gun, right? Where they would hide it in a location where they didn't want to be caught with it on their person.
Because they knew that the police could stop them at any time and recover the gun, arrest them, and they would be put in jail before they go to court. So they would be off the streets and not a menace to society. Whereas now, as you poignantly pointed out, it's catch and release. And they're not afraid of A, the police stopping them as often, and B, certainly not getting prosecuted, so they keep redoing it.
You mentioned something earlier about judges and giving them the discretion when it comes to holding someone for the commission of a crime, right? When they are being prosecuted and bail is set, we all know that the general synopsis of bail was to ensure that the defendant returned to court for prosecution. You know, other states have used it they weighed it where they would determine the individual's impact on society. Were they a threat to the community? And that added to whether they would be held. You know, I have a bill that actually would give judges discretion that would allow that, right? Where they can take that into account. Unfortunately, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle refuse to budge on that. They don't want to give judges discretion when it comes to that. And I think that's something where we're seeing recidivism start to escalate, where we're seeing in New York City, a majority of the crime committed is probably by the same 10, 15% of individuals that have been released under this catch and release program that we created with bail reform. Now, I'm not saying we need to take a sledgehammer to bail reform. What we need is a scalpel. And I actually said this on the floor during the debate. It was unfortunate that when they tried to make some adjustments to bail reform, I said, we needed a doctor in the house because we needed a scalpel. Because we could have tweaked this the way it could have worked, and we could have all walked away here with some satisfaction that we're doing something for our community. Unfortunately, they didn't do that, and they dug their feet in the sand. They drew the line in the sand. They didn't want to budge. And unfortunately, that's the same thing that's happening now.
Wow, it looks like you and your colleagues have a lot of work cut out for them to try to righten the wrongs that have been done in the last few years. We're seeing an increase, like I said before, across the board in New York City from bail reform legislation, particularly in youthful offenders. Is decriminalizing youthful offenders working?
It's definitely not working. Unfortunately, we're going to get people that are the advocates, that are the loudest voice, that are creating policy in New York State. You know, there's a reason why 4,000 people marching in the city caused us to have bail reform, caused us to have other changes in legislation. It's not necessarily what the overall community wants. It seems to be the squeaky wheel that gets what they want. And we're seeing the results now. I think it's going to get worse because now there's been legislation where anyone 12 years or under will not be prosecuted at all. So if you think about that, someone who commits an arson of a building that's occupied, a house, and they are 11 years old, and they intentionally light that fire, they won't be charged in criminal court. When the laws previously said that they should be held accountable as an adult. You know, it was the old adage that we learned in the police academy, right?
Right.
Mark A. Abrams.
That's
I remember it like it was yesterday.
Right. That's right.
But unfortunately, Mark A. Abrams has now left the building.
Wow. Well, we need to rethink this, and you put it again very wisely, not with the sledgehammer, but with the scalpel. I don't think anybody's suggesting that we just get rid of bail reform. Bail reform was put there for a reason, and I understand the reason, to protect certain category of people that perhaps can't afford bail for lesser crimes that they commit, and thus they're spending weeks, if not months, in jail waiting for their case to be heard. But there's got to be a happy medium with both camps on the bail reform issue, where the people that are recidivists or the people that are violent offenders do not get out scot-free, and they do get withheld because, as you said, and as the statistics point out, a lot of these people that get let go, they just simply commit the crime again. And it's a revolving door where they know, okay, if they get arrested, they're going to be out the same day, if not the next day. So what's their disincentive, for lack of a better word, to not commit the same or worse crimes? Yeah. So this is something that's going to have to be studied, argued, and corrected as soon as possible, because this is going to continue going as these criminal violent offenders recognize, realize, and practice work, having the law work with them and not against them as violent criminals.
Yeah. Let's not forget about the what bail reform did to discovery with the district attorney's offices, where it put a real unfunded mandate originally on them complying with ensuring that they get all the documents to the defendant's attorneys for discovery. There's been some piecemeal to that, where we've been trying to add some money, some funds to district attorneys throughout the state so that they can abide by the law. But unfortunately, right now, the time is very stringent on them. And it's, you know, it's given, it went from, it swung the pendulum from being close to leaning towards the DA to the seesaw all the way up in the air, where it's totally on the defendant's side. And I don't necessarily disagree that we should give some leeway to the defendants because we want to make sure that they have enough resources and they have the ability to defend themselves. But there comes a time where you have to have common sense. You have to have some common ground, and it has to be an equal playing field. We can't go from one end to the other. that rapidly without seeing some negative consequences.
Agreed. And unfortunately, now we have, you touched on another leg of that stool, which are the prosecutors. They're voted in by the public, and a lot of them have put in paper, actually, that they will not prosecute certain crimes, including violent crimes. And eventually that gets out to the bad guys on the street, and they know that they're not going to be prosecuted, that if they're arrested, they're going to be released within X amount of hours, if not a day. And all of this is like what we discussed earlier, the perfect storm, just like with the fentanyl crisis where people are dying. People are afraid to live in certain areas, are afraid to be in the city, are certainly afraid to go to the subway, travel in the subway for fear of people, mentally ill people, um, criminals that are running amok, and that causes a lot of other problems. With that, I'll give you the last word, and I'll thank you for coming on our show, Assemblyman. You're right to the point. Uh, your policies that you presented to the state are on point, and hopefully people will start seeing the light, because obviously what's happening right now is not working. So thank you for your service. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being on our show. And anything else you want to add?
Hey, thank you for having me. I mean, it's been great talking with you today. And, the only thing I could say is we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of pointing out where we can come up with common ground. I will work with anybody in the state legislature. I don't mind crossing the aisle. I do it all the time. It is about relationships up there. And what I try and do is I try and share my experience. I try and give them a firsthand account of what it's like doing police work, what it's like as a school board member, for all the issues that we talk about. Because even though that looks like two different hats, believe it or not, they intertwine. Because we go from making sure that the police have a good relationship with the youth. So that's where education and police would come hand in hand. And I think that's some of the shortfalls we see on the other side. They don't realize that there's an opportunity here to build bridges. And there's an opportunity here where we can help our communities. But when we start labeling people just because of the uniforms they wear, just because of where they live, that's where the issue arises. We have to realize that when we come together, we can solve these problems.
Ladies and gentlemen, Assembly Mike Reilly. Thank you for coming, Mike.
Thank you.